When I was 20 years old, my best mate and I did a road trip up to Noosa. And somewhere on the north coast, on the outskirts of Yamba, we took a wide bend too fast and began to skid out. I remember this terrible sensation of panic, skidding, but then the sense of relief as we corrected, but then panic again as we overcorrected and then rolled the car, and rolled again, finally landing on the roof. I remember this in vivid detail. It was like it was all in slow motion. I remember my friend saying, "Are you okay?" while the car was rolling, and me saying, "Not yet." But in fact, we were. We landed on our roof, but we were miraculously unharmed. The only injuries we sustained were when we released our seatbelts upside down, landing on our heads and crawling out through the broken windscreen of the car covered in broken glass. It could have been so much worse. There could have been traffic coming the other way. There could have been a tree. We were very, very fortunate not to have been more hurt. And although I was the passenger, not the driver in that accident, it certainly slowed me down. It took away some of my youthful invincibility and made me a much more cautious, careful driver afterwards. That near tragedy served to be a very good lesson for me. Jesus uses tragic events as a lesson in the gospel today. We hear the disciples arrive and tell Jesus about people whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. An awful, cruel act where clearly Pilate's soldiers had killed some Jewish people who were in the midst of offering their regular Jewish sacrifice and then mingled their own human blood with the animal blood, a desecration as well as an awful, tragic killing. And Jesus then uses an opportunity to ask them a question. We don't know whether the disciples were just reporting the news or whether they came with a question. I think that from context they probably did. They probably told Jesus about this and would have said, "Why, Jesus? What did they do to deserve this awful, cruel and tragic end?" Because in the Old Testament and this Jewish context, people believed, as some people still believe today, that there is punishment for sin here on earth. And if you've done something wrong, then God will punish you for it. This is very much, it comes up again and again in the Old Testament, but even at the time of Jesus, we hear people ask Jesus, who sinned for this man to be born blind, him or his parents? There was a strong sense of connection between sin and suffering, even though the book of Job works very hard to dispel that. So Jesus answered, "Do you think these people were any worse sinners than the other people in Galilee? No," he says, "they were not." And then he uses a different example. What about the people whom a tower fell on and killed? Do you think they were worse sinners than others? No, they were not, I tell you. So Jesus very clearly, very deliberately breaks that notion that if we sin, that we will be punished for it. And conversely, if we are suffering, that we must have done something wrong to deserve this. This is really, really important that we hear this because many people still labour under that false notion and say, what have I done to deserve this? Suffering is so often undeserved. Sometimes there are consequences for our actions, yes, but there's no sense in anything Jesus ever teaches that God is going to punish us for our bad actions here and now. There will be judgment, end of time, but we're not going to suffer grievous, awful deaths or suffering because of our own sins. It's just something Jesus totally excludes. It's really important for us because we're hearing in Jesus' two examples an act of cruelty and violence, human-induced, and a natural disaster of sorts, a building collapse. In the last 2 weeks and ongoing now, we've had the dreadful loss of life and suffering in the floods up north, including Lismore, and the people suffering and fleeing in Ukraine. A natural disaster and a human-induced disaster and suffering. So people might ask the same question. Did the people who died in the floods in Lismore deserve it? And Jesus' answer is clearly no. Do the people of Ukraine deserve to suffer as they do? And Jesus' answer to them is no. And that would be a wonderful, clear message in of itself. We could stop and leave it there. But Jesus goes on to say something else, which I must say I find quite confronting. Jesus then says, no, these people didn't deserve this. They didn't do anything wrong, or they weren't worse sinners to deserve what they got. But he says to the disciples, unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. And he says that twice. It's quite deliberate. Unless you repent, you will all perish as they did. Which to me, at first glance, for many years, sounds to me like a threat. Jesus threatening, saying, unless you repent, if you keep on sinning, God is going to strike you down. God is going to punish you. Even though Jesus has just gone out of his way to say, no, that's not the case. So what is it Jesus is saying? Well, what Jesus is saying is not a threat, but it's a warning. Unless you repent, you will all die as they did. But we have to then work out, what do we mean? What did Jesus mean by die as they did? Does he mean die suddenly, die violently, die cruelly? Well, no, I don't think Jesus means any of those things. What Jesus means is die unprepared. These people who died suddenly had no chance to prepare themselves, no chance to repent, no chance to get right with God and deal with their own sin. And that's Jesus' point. Unless we repent, we'll end up, maybe we'll die at old age, end of a long, happy life, but we can still die unprepared if we don't take the opportunities before us to repent, to get right, to examine our conscience, to get right with God. And that is Jesus' point. And that is why we receive this gospel from the church in the season of Lent. Jesus goes on then with the parable of the fig tree around a second chance and a third chance, but in the end, judgment there for the fig tree. So what can we do to not be as they were, to not die unrepentant and not die unprepared? It is to make use of the gift God offers us to say sorry, which involves firstly examining our conscience and doing that well and thoughtfully and prayerfully. To dig deep and think, how have I been? And particularly I invite you to think about the last year or two in lockdown, which brought the best and the worst in many of us. Are there sins which we've become aware of, or bad habits have crept in that we haven't turned away from throughout this lockdown period? These would be great things to bring to God and to say sorry. And for us to use the sacrament of reconciliation which our church gives us as a means to very clearly define that we are saying sorry, and to receive very clearly the grace and forgiveness of God as the priest prays for us the prayer of absolution. We offer this sacrament many times in our church. We offer it every Monday night, 6 o'clock at OLHC Epping. We offer it every Friday night, 6 o'clock at St Gerard's, Carlingford. We offer it on Saturday mornings at OLHC after morning mass. We offer it on Saturday nights at St Gerard's before the vigil mass. There are many opportunities. We invite you to make use of those. But during the season of Lent, we'll also offer a second rite of reconciliation where we'll come together in St Gerard's Church on Tuesday, the 5th of April, at 7 o'clock, and we'll have several priests here. We'll have a short time of prayer and reflection together, and then you'll be invited to go to see one of the 5 or 6 priests we have for your personal individual confession, to receive that individual reconciliation, and then come back together again as a whole community to celebrate the forgiveness God has given us. This second rite is still individual, personal reconciliation. We still have to say sorry, but we still get to receive personally God's forgiveness, that then we celebrate together. So I invite you, heed the message of this extraordinary, at times challenging gospel Jesus gives us, and let's find the way to make use of the God's invitation for us to repent and to be forgiven.